Mastering Git in GitHub is absolutely fundamental to software development today for several reasons. Number one, great software happens when we take the experience of several developers and we combine it together to create something incredible. And GitHub allows us to do that easily and keep our source code in sync. Number two, it's a portfolio of all of the things that we've done. Number three, it's what I call the Control-Z of programming, because anytime you make a commit, you can roll back to that commit if things go wrong, so it allows you to try an experiment. So, I have a previous video where I cover the fundamentals of Git and GitHub, but in this video we're going to take a look at how to implement GitHub in Visual Studio 2022. And I believe it's important to do this as one of the very first things that you do so that you can start good habits early in the development process. So first, let's open up Visual Studio and create a new project. I'm going to choose ASP.NET Core Web Apps so I can make a Razor page. And we'll call this Plant Diary. One thing I found very helpful is Team Explorer, which often appears in this upper right corner. If you don't see it, simply go to View and choose Team Explorer. We will refer to this several times throughout our Git journey. Now this is Visual Studio 2022, which has a bit of a change over Visual Studio 2019. In Visual Studio 2019, you had to download a GitHub plugin to use GitHub and connect with GitHub with your project. But in 2022, GitHub integration is built in, and we get it through a different menu system. We get it through the Git menu up here. So I'm going to go to Git and choose Create Git Repository. And notice when I do that, it has an option to create a new GitHub repository. Now this is a brand new installation of Visual Studio 2022 on a relatively new laptop that I have. I've not yet signed into GitHub from this laptop from Visual Studio 2022. Let's go ahead and do that. You see, that was fairly painless. It basically just opened a browser, but the advantage here is I've already signed into GitHub on my browser. So it simply went to the browser and said, okay, I know who you are. I can go ahead and sign you in. And sure enough, there's my GitHub user ID and my photo. Let's do a before and after and take a look at what my GitHub repository looks like before I push this and then after. Right now we see 68 repositories, and the latest one is an assignment that I put together. So let's go ahead and choose Create and Push. Now, by the way, take a look. Take a look down there. If you can rewind the video if you didn't see that, but you notice that it changed down here, and we now have something that says Plant Diary 2022 where we didn't have that before. Also, take a look at this. You notice this is a branch called Master. So that's a master branch. We can have multiple branches, and that's something we'll talk about a little bit later. But once we create the repository, we'll see that we have this master branch. Master is a traditional name. A lot of times people use main now. So that just means the big branch, the branch that is the latest, the one that's in production. Either master or main. You might hear people use those interchangeably. You might hear me use them interchangeably. My recommendation to you, if you have a choice, is to go with main, because that's basically what people are going to use going forward. Let's take a look at my GitHub. So remember, we had 68 projects. I'm going to choose Refresh. And you notice that now we have 69 projects in this new one called Plant Diary 2022. Now, one very important thing that I want to point out is this Git Ignore file that you see that was generated for us by Visual Studio. Git Ignore is very important, and you notice this is a relatively long file. Now, the reason why Git Ignore is important is we don't want to commit and push everything to our version control repository. For example, we don't want to push anything that's specific to our local environment, a Mac, Windows, Linux, whatever you're using. You don't want to have anything that has hard-coded paths, because the idea is that your teammates should be able to clone this, and they'll have their own settings that they will use. They don't need to clone yours. Number two, we don't want to push compiled files, because we can always recompile them based on source code, and the source code is what we're actually pushing to GitHub. Now, why don't we want to push compiled files? Well, Git looks at differences between one commit and another commit. And if it senses that there's a huge amount of difference, usually about 50%, it will say, uh-oh, these things aren't related, and you'll end up with a multiple head scenario, which is a little sticky to get out of. Now, if you change one line of source code, that's a very small percentage of a large source code file. However, if you recompile, that will change the entire binary that results. And so to GitHub and Git, it says, oh my gosh, this entire thing changed. This must be something major. So we want to filter out those. We also want to filter out any API keys that we're using. We can use another framework for doing that. But nonetheless, Git Ignore is a file that says, these are all of the files that are not going to get to GitHub. Luckily now, most development environments will create a Git Ignore file for you. It used to be a task you had to do for yourself, and you had to kind of guess on what to do. Well, okay, there is one other time where you might want to make a custom Git Ignore file, and that's if you're combining multiple technologies together. But guess what? There's an easy way to do that. If I go to gitignore.io, what I can do is simply type in my ecosystem here, and it will generate a Git Ignore for me. So Visual Studio or Visual Studio Code, if you prefer that. We could say C#, or we could just say C, C++, anything like that. See if we have nothing for Razor Page, ASP.NET Core. Yeah, select as many as you want and then choose Create, and then it will create this Git Ignore file for you. What you could do, which we don't have to do with our project because we already have a Git Ignore, but what you could do is take this generated Git Ignore and simply paste it into your project. So, nonetheless, if we take a look at Solution Explorer, we should see some things that look a little bit familiar with our Git repository. So, I'll go ahead and go back, and we'll see Plant Diary 2022, we'll see Pages, and then error CSHTML, so on and so forth. If we go to our Solution Explorer, we see Pages, and we see a very similar view. Now, it alphabetizes a bit differently here, so they're not in the same order, but they are the same files. Now, let's go to Team Explorer, and let's look at Git Changes. And right now you see there are no unstaged changes in the working directory. That means essentially our development environment is in sync with GitHub. But let's go ahead and make a change to one of our files, and then let's commit and push, and let's see what difference we see in that Team Explorer. So go back to Solution Explorer, let's choose our index page, and it has a fairly standard welcome. Let's say welcome to Plant Diary, and save, and then I go to Git Changes and take a look. Index CSHTML indicates that it has changed, and we can double click on it and we can see the before and after. The before on the left, the after on the right. What's interesting to point out here is that anything that was removed will show up in red, anything added will show up in green, and you see it kind of gives us a bit of emphasis here that to my Plant Diary is what was added. So let's go ahead and commit and push this up to our GitHub repo. So I'll say enhance the title, and I'm going to click the little drop down arrow here because I don't just want to commit, I want to commit and push. And commit and sync is actually a really good idea as well. What's the difference? Commit means it's committing to a Git repository on my local machine. Commit and push means it's committing to that local repository and it's pushing those changes up to my remote as well. Commit all and sync means it's committing, it's pushing my changes up, and it's also receiving changes from GitHub that somebody else might have put in there. As a general rule, that's the best option to follow, is that commit and sync. So let's go ahead and choose commit all and sync, and you see it does the little hourglass here, and we're back to no unstaged changes. Let's take a look again at our GitHub repository and see how that's changed. So right now you see we had a commit 6 minutes ago. I'll nicely go back and back again, and we see that we had 2 commits. I hit refresh, and now you see we have 3 commits. I choose the 3rd commit, enhance the title, and what do we see once again? You can see the difference in the red and the green, and you can see that I've changed that title. So that's a very simple way to initiate a project and push the project and use the Visual Studio IDE to do it. One thing to keep in mind though is that Git, GitHub, Visual Studio, these are actually all different things. So there's great integration with Visual Studio, which is not a big surprise, because keep in mind who owns Visual Studio, Microsoft. And keep in mind who owns GitHub, also Microsoft. Little footnote on that. GitHub was co-founded by a gentleman named Chris Wansrath, who is a University of Cincinnati alumnus, and he eventually sold the company to Microsoft. So kudos to Chris and kudos to UC on behalf of Chris for doing that. But nonetheless, a good integration there. But you can use Git in GitHub outside of Visual Studio as well. You can use it on a terminal. So let's go ahead and make another change, and let's see how we can use command line to do a very similar operation to the one that we've just done. So return back to Visual Studio. We'll take away this diff and go to our index.cs.html. This kind of text here I don't really need, so I'm going to say catalog your plants where they are when they have been watered and fertilized. For example, and I know I have a couple of spelling errors there, but we just want to make a simple change. So I choose Save, and now I'm going to go to Tools and Command Line, and we'll just do a simple developer command prompt. Now from here, I can choose Git Add period, which means add any files that need to be staged. Then I can say Git Commit -m, where -m lets me put a message if I want in quotes. So I'll say enhance the greeting on the first page. Okay, now you see we get a confirmation message. Now let's go back to our presentation we were looking at just a moment ago and remember a couple of words that can be confusing. So git push origin master is the next thing that we need to do. Git push means move the changes from my local to a remote. Now origin is a nickname for the remote, where when I say remote, what I mean in my case is GitHub. We could call it whatever we want. Origin is pretty much a default. That's the one that typically is our first remote, but you could call it my project, you could call it whatever. But when you see origin, think that's the remote. What about master? Well, remember that master is a branch. So we're saying we're pushing the master branch to the remote called origin. Remember that master branch is the thing that we see here. Once again, branches are a huge advantage to using Git in GitHub, and something that we'll cover a little bit later because, you know, this is just some introduction. But branches are incredibly useful. So that the idea that you can push different branches at different times gives us a whole lot of flexibility in how we develop our applications. Nonetheless, let me run back to the command prompt, and I will say git push origin master, and we see a message comes out. And now let's go back to our repository one more time. So go back to Plant Diary 2022. You see before it had, I believe, was it 3 commits? Yeah, I think it had 3 commits. You see now it has 4 commits. I click on the 4 commits and take a look, enhance the greeting on the first page, and you see the difference between the greeting that we got by default and the one that I changed. And really, if you look at these last 2 commits, the one I made using the user interface and the one I made using command line, they're essentially the same. I mean, the content's different, but the way they got to GitHub is the same, and the look and feel in GitHub is the same. You can't tell that one was done with the UI tool and one was done with the command line, because under the covers, it's the same thing. The UI tool is simply issuing those same commands. So, choose your preference if you want to do that. You can even get a standalone Git client. A lot of people will have one of those and really swear by it. Either way, the reason I wanted to do this video a bit early in the sequence is that getting familiar with GitHub is a good habit to get into, and it's a good habit to get into early. So as always, I hope this video was helpful, and I look forward to hearing your comments. Thank you.